Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. We are very honored at the CEFC Taipei to have today Rowen for this lecture based on his newest book, One China, Many Taiwans, the Geopolitics of Cross-Strait Tourism. So a bit of promotion for the book. Rowen is an associate professor in the Department of Taiwan Culture, Languages, and Literature at National Taiwan Normal University. He previously served as assistant professor of sociology, geography, and urban planning at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So his work on culture, politics, and placemaking has appeared in many journals, such as the Journal of Asian Studies, Annals of the American Association of Geographers, etc. And his book, so what we will be talking about today, One China, Many Taiwans, the Geopolitics of Cross-Strait Tourism, was published by Cornell University Press in 2023. So
22, 23, it's not clear to me, actually. Yeah, it says 22 in the book, but it came out in January.
Oh, yeah. So maybe late December 22.
Yeah.
And we will be joined afterward by our discussant, Benjamin Taunay, an assistant professor at Angers University. And he will be talking about the book. So I will present him after Ayan's presentation. So please welcome Rowen for this talk. And just a moment.
Yeah. Great. All right. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back at CEFC. I was actually affiliated here, I think, from 2017 to 2018 or 19, something like that. And the last time I spoke here was about the sunflower movement and the umbrella movement with some other CEFC scholars. So it's really a pleasure to be back. One small thing. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is pronounced Ian. No, yeah, no issue. Yeah. So in case anyone asks a question, so I'm sure who I'm being, if I'm being asked. So yeah, it's great to be back. And before I start talking about the book, I'd like to just preface it by explaining the origin a little bit. Before I did academia, before I started my postgraduate work, which is what led to this book, I'd actually worked as a tour guide in China. And that's kind of the origin story of this book. In 2006, after spending 4 years in Taiwan, studying language, working in media and film and some other things, I went to China. And my second job there was as a tour director. I was taking around Americans, Europeans, Latin Americans, and anyone who spoke enough English for me to communicate with them around China. And this was kind of at the heyday of fascination with China among Euro-American high society. I was taking around high-end tourists. These were policymakers, business people, minor celebrities and the like, who were experiencing China, as the company said, in style. And I realized as I was taking them around China, I was really interpreting and translating not just the language, but China as a place, as a territory. And this led to some of the ideas in this book, that of the tour guide or the tour director as a territorial translator, as someone who can really frame the experience of a place for the tourist in a way with material effects, especially given that some of my tourists were Goldman Sachs bankers in a position to direct capital into different circuits in China in ways that would actually have an impact at journalists and other people. So tourism, I realized, was not just fun and games. It wasn't just a leisure activity, but it was in fact something that was highly influential in a geoeconomic and even geopolitical sense. And I went from that job to working in a Taiwan-owned hotel in South China in Guilin, the Hotel of Modern Art, which is now actually a Club Med. It was pitched as a high-end boutique hotel, and we certainly had all kinds of high-end interesting guests, but it never made all that much money. And eventually, as Club Med, which I believe has French origins, was bought out by a Chinese-backed concern, I think through some capital funneled through Dubai, this hotel became a Club Med. But in any event, I mention this because working there for a year and a half for Taiwanese owner, Taiwanese executives, but Chinese staff, and then a wide range of guests, I realized that within China, there's this, despite what sounds like more or less the same language and people who can tactically perform more or less the same ethno-national membership, there was all kinds of misrecognition happening all the time. And this influenced my graduate study, which I designed in part to get me back to Taiwan and to China and to see how this would work. And in so doing, I decided I would tour China with Taiwanese people, and I will and see what that meant and what kind of Taiwan and China that was producing. So with that as a preface, I'll kind of walk us through the book, more or less read in as conversational a way as possible the first few pages to give you a sense of what it's like before walking us through the individual chapters. All right, I think we're good. Yeah. So in 2008, as the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, pointed thousands of missiles towards Taiwan, it started sending millions of tourists the same way. And perhaps some of you were here and might remember this. The tourists were welcomed not only by a travel industry eager for new sources of revenue, but by President Ma Ying-jeou, recently, very high-profile tourist to China himself, just a month or so ago, who was elected earlier that year. President Ma claimed that the opening would strengthen the economy and improve Taiwan's relations with what he called mainland China. The tourists, said Ma's administration, might return home with a positive impression of Taiwan's democracy, which would lead to mutual understanding and maybe even political reconciliation. Still, despite the growing flow of leisure travelers and the social, economic, and political connections that they facilitated, citizens and officials on both sides of the Taiwan Strait didn't quite agree on the cultural character or spatial definition of the territories they were traveling between. It turned out that tourism deepened the difference. As far as most Chinese tourists were concerned, they were traveling in a part of China, culturally familiar, if undeniably distinct politically. Indeed, Taiwan, an archipelago of 23 or 24 million people, it's the western shore of its main island where we sit now, 150 kilometers away across a heavily militarized strait, was listed, and still is, as a province on all PRC maps and passports. As far as Chinese authorities were concerned, the ultimate goal of all cross-strait policy, including tourism, was political control and ultimately annexation, euphemistically referred to as unification or reunification, and defined as, quote, a national core interest. Some China-friendly leaders in Taiwan also hoped for territorial unification, even if they had a different vision of what that future China would look like and how it would be governed. However, many people in Taiwan had a different idea entirely, that these mainland guests, or luke as they called them, were entering a different country, where they were welcome to spend their money, have a good time, mind their own business, and then go home. For those concerned about PRC irredentism, tourism looked like one of another several weapons aimed at Taiwan's sovereignty. And as it happened, at the same time that cross-strait tourism accelerated, so did Taiwanese national identification and pro-independence sentiment, leading to unprecedented protests and electoral shifts against PRC-friendly politicians. A potential for tension should have been clear, for 2008 was not the first time that Taiwan had received a rapid influx of arrivals from China. 60-odd years earlier, at the close of World War II, Taiwan was overwhelmed by weary and desperate soldiers serving the Chinese Nationalist Party, the KMT or Kuomintang, who were then retreating from the military advance of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. These soldiers and the KMT-dominated state apparatus they propped up, the Republic of China, or ROC, occupied Taiwan in 1945 with the support of the US after Imperial Japan was forced to end its half-century of colonization. Many Taiwanese saw the military men as uncouth and unhygienic, qualities not so dissimilar from those later attributed to 21st century Chinese tourists. But unlike today's tourists, these soldiers had nowhere to return to after the CCP consolidated its control and established the PRC in Beijing. They instead were pressed to enforce the repressive and often murderous rule of the émigré ROC in Taiwan, and sometimes also suffered violence themselves under the authoritarian KMT regime. Even after the lifting of martial law in 1987, Taiwanese have continued to live under the ever-present threat of Chinese military invasion, this time from the PRC, whose leaders have pledged to eventually, quote, reunify Taiwan by any means necessary. Subtly written into the practice of tourism then, amidst the rhetoric of reconciliation, was the recapitulation of a past military occupation and the foreshadowing of a future assault. Such semiotic excess evokes, and sorry, I'm going to mutilate his name in a French space, Jacques Derrida's meditation on the etymological entwinement and transmutable tension between hospitality and hostility, in which he suggests that, quote, for the invited guest, as much as for the visitor, the crossing of the threshold always remains a transgressive step. Taiwan's thresholds are tense, tangled, and constructed through a series of transgressions. Here, tourism animates guests, hosts, and guides in a turbulent dance of difference and identity, making plain that travel is no mere leisure activity. It is rather a stage for struggle over ethnic identity and national borders, a geopolitical instrument and event that performs and can potentially transform state territory. Tourism, I will demonstrate, has been one of several strategies aimed at achieving the political control of Taiwan for the PRC. But how has it worked in practice? And what does this case have to say to the claims of so many tourism scholars and industry and political leaders that tourism can promote peace and mutual understanding? My book argues that contrary to the PRC's efforts to incorporate Taiwan as part of an undivided one China, tourism actually aggravated tensions between the two polities, polarized Taiwanese society, and pushed Taiwanese popular sentiment farther towards support for national self-determination. In the process, Taiwan's staging of state sovereignty bifurcated into what could be described as two Taiwans. The Taiwan performed as a part of China for group tourists versus the Taiwan experienced as a site of everyday life by local residents and some independent tourists. This split corresponded with a growing fissure of domestic political economy, amplifying a conflict between those business, civil society, and state actors that had an interest in sustaining a PRC-oriented travel industry and versus those who didn't. These tourism-inflected two Taiwans are among the most vivid manifestations of inconsistent nationalisms spanning a territory that was already realizing a distinct and distinctively inclusive subjectivity. In fact, Taiwan's identity is increasingly predicated on a pluralistic civic nationalism in which not just one or two, but many Taiwans coexist more or less comfortably, even as it is existentially threatened. Although the transformations of Taiwan and China are the focus of this study, attention to their unusual features can illustrate the role of everyday practices, such as the use of national flags, maps, names, and travel permits, and the conduct of tourism and the production of political spaces elsewhere. Indeed, looking at everyday practices of state administration and interpersonal encounter in contested states sheds light on the peculiarity of normative sovereignties more generally. Likewise, looking at the exceptional and even world-shattering moments can shed light on peculiar practices long taken for granted. By traveling along such spatial and temporal edges of sovereignty, one can witness the instability of the center. In this case, the notion of exclusive state territory, an elusive yet persistent phantasm that haunts the gaps and fissures of the world system, its incomplete suture to international representative bodies like the UN rupturing violently into view through the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 through now, which imploded global mobility and illuminated the geopolitical stakes of tourism. So when I began this project as a graduate student in 2010, scholarship on this topic and on cross-strait tourism more generally assumed an effect of reconciliation and rapprochement, which is symptomatic, I think, of much of tourism studies assumptions about peace and borders, which usually elide anything unpleasant about politics. And the usual treatment of Taiwan and mainland China is, as we see in these journals I've just snipped up here, Taiwan and China are partition states expected to reconcile and maybe even unify in part through tourism. Most Chinese language scholarship, whether it was done in Taiwan or in China, usually assumed an endpoint of reconciliation, whatever that means, and focused largely on economic impacts or destination marketing. You know, how can Taiwan be sold to Chinese tourists? What kind of routes should they go on? And so on. So my book here speaks back to this body of scholarship, and it aims to open up new trajectories for Taiwan studies, but also more broadly social sciences and humanities more generally, which has, I think, mistakenly assumed what we might trace back to this contact hypothesis of the 60s, wishful thinking that the more people spend time together, the more they understand and get along. I'd like that to be true, and I think most tourism scholars and practitioners would as well. It would make us feel good about ourselves. Tourism, you know, not only makes money, it makes peace. But having worked in tourism, I realized that we can't really assume that that's the case. So one of the key kind of conceptual touchstones of this book is performance and performativity. I open the introduction, another section of the introduction, with the account of doing research here at Sanyat-sen Memorial Hall. And I spent a whole lot of time there in the summer of 2012. I did this fieldwork between 2011, 2012, and then particularly intensively in 2014 through 2016. 2012 was a particularly hot summer, and I found myself subletting a place near Sanyat-sen Memorial Hall. And so it was just so hot in the daytime that I would basically hide out in my apartment, reading, analyzing tourist guides, looking at stuff online, reading books, and so on. And then at 3 p.m., as it cooled down enough, I would go out, hang out in around the hall, and basically stalk tourists. If I heard people speaking with mainland accent, I would go up and say, "Hey, I'm a grad student. Can we talk?" And maybe they would actually make time for me to have something like a formal interview. Maybe it would just be a 5 or 10 minute conversation, and I would jot down as many notes as possible. Or sometimes I would walk around the hall and just observe what was going on and see these tourists and take photos. So this is a photo I took at I think every hour or so. The guards will walk around with their bayonets and perform the ROC in a way that this one tourist found kind of off-putting. He yelled out, "This is all just for show." I saw him complaining loudly to anyone who would listen, his fellow tourists, Taiwanese that were there. And I think this tourist is not wrong. The military guards wearing these uniforms and marching with bayonets and precisely timed drills were giving a show. The monument itself, with its grandiose, if somewhat dilapidated now, facade and this gigantic statue of Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the ROC, was designed for show. And also the tourists' loud public dismissal was a kind of show. But it's the theatricality of the show and what he was doing that makes it actually powerful. The performance with the soldiers and the tourist, like the tourist's prior encounter with the border guard on his arrival to Taiwan and his application for a travel permit to come here in the first place, produced the tourist and the toward Taiwan as national subjects or national places. In so doing, it produced, reproduced, and troubled the state and interstate system. And I think we all know this because most of us have traveled, right? Pandemic punctuations notwithstanding, millions of tourists cross borders every year. Passports in hand, these tourists act as the citizen subjects of the various nation states of the world. They travel, and we travel, for any number of reasons. And when we cross borders from our own country into another and then return home, we not only carry memories and souvenirs, we, along with border agents and airlines, travel agents and tour operators, are performing, effectively enacting, and potentially transforming the borders that we cross and the territories that we traverse. So the central point, the central argument of this book is that tourism performs and transforms state territory. And this argument is informed by Michel Foucault's Analytics of Government, which attends to, quote, points of contact between the technologies of domination of others and those of the self. These social and political technologies produce temporarily durable but never finished subjects and objects. Seen in this way, states and citizens are not a priori political agents, and territories are not passive spatial containers, but are rather effects of power-laden relationships, always already in a state of flux, of becoming, of change, contradiction, rupture, and reformation. And so, to put the point concisely, tourism can and should be theorized as the technology of state territorialization. So what does it mean to perform state territory, and how might tourism transform it? So I'd like to begin with territory, which is better conceived as an act or a practice than an object or a physical space. I treat territory as a practice and pattern of relations that names, claims, calculates, and bounds space. And here I'm borrowing not only from Foucault, but from geographers such as Joe Painter, who suggests that the state might be thought of as an imagined collective actor. And so I use this term state territorialization to refer to the particular practices by which space is rendered or configured as belonging to and bounded by this collective actor imagined as a particular state. However, this collective actor is imagined, the practices, mechanisms, and institutions through which the processes of interpolation of state subjects and state spaces take place are very real and often violent. So territories acquire spatial definition through the production and reproduction of borders, which establish constitutive divisions between what is inside and what is outside. And because these are social practices that take place in time, I use a term from another geographer, David Newman, territorial socialization, to talk about the kind of social practices by which people become attached or claim particular territories. And David Newman, who was writing in the context mostly of Israel and Palestine, has observed that often places just outside effective administrative borders, but still within other imagined boundaries, often become cast as crucial to the integrity of a territorial unit, amplifying a potential for conflict. And I think we can see how Taiwan serves this kind of function for China, just outside the PRC's effective borders, and thereby that much more important for its performance of sovereignty. So if territoriality pivots on this constitutive division between what is inside and what is outside, tourism pivots on a similar distinction between the guest and the host. Early works in tourism theory tend to treat the guest as a typical or even the quintessential subject, a modern subject, in search of a sense of authenticity and difference from home. So I think these early works in tourism theory, and I'm thinking here of The Tourist by Dean McCannell or The Tourist Gaze by Jean Ury, a sociologist, are quite useful for giving some theoretical inspiration. Their background, their rooting in Euro-American tourism somewhat limits their application to this case. I found that Chinese tourists, and not just myself, other scholars who work on them, have found that Chinese tourists are often actually at least as interested in a sense of affinity, of similarity, of resemblance, a sense of home when abroad, as they are in a sense of exotic difference. To be sure, there are Chinese tourists who are looking for exotica as well, but many of them want to see other Chinese people when they're out. They want to eat Chinese food. They want to see they don't care about that kind of exotic other in the same way that the imagined quintessential Euro-American subject does. So there's a very particular and very peculiar thing happening in the case of Chinese tourism to Taiwan. I've just noticed that a lot of tourists are looking for difference. Chinese tourists are a bit different, sometimes looking for sameness. There's really no account, I think, before this one that can describe what's happening in the case of Chinese tourism to Taiwan, which is where these Han Chinese guests from China identify Taiwanese hosts as fellow ethno-national subjects, albeit under a distinct political regime that they are themselves implicated in transforming, but with limited recognition that their sense of ethno-national fellowship is seldom shared by their hosts here in Taiwan. There's this fundamental misrecognition happening. And here, these tricky gaps between spaces and senses of identity and difference are mediated through the personage of the guide, a professional specialist who interprets for and translates between them, even within what sounds like the same language. And I argue throughout the ethnographic sections of this book that the translational work of guides, whether fulfilled with faithful or fraudulent intent, is not mimetic, but creative and productive. They're quite skillful. They stage things, they sequence things. And through that, and through the props they use, through the actors they work with, the vendors, the drivers, and whoever else, they don't only smoothen social difference between guests and hosts, but they actually reassemble the worlds that they're traveling between. And to account for this, I coined this term territorial translation, and I describe in great detail later how the guides do this. So this is what the book looks like as a table of contents. I'll just kind of run us through how it looks and give us kind of a tour, if you will, of the book. The first chapter begins with a very common tale of Taiwanese scholars and students. Maybe typically when I give these talks to Taiwanese audiences, there's often someone in the room who's experienced this themselves. They attempted to enter the United Nations public spaces in Geneva, only to be told they can't enter. They need to show the passport of a member country, and the ROC in Taiwan is not a member country of the United Nations, and therefore they can't enter at all. And this is a way to basically open up a tour of Taiwan's history as an exceptional territory. And it treats Taiwan's exceptional territoriality as a legacy of multiple waves of colonization, democratization, and diplomatic crises. And this is the kind of chapter I had to do in part to satisfy a reviewer frankly, and to make the book that much more accessible to non-specialists on Taiwan. I was a bit annoyed to have to write this chapter. I think many of us who write journal articles also often find ourselves devoting at least a third of the journal article to recapitulating the kinds of history we wouldn't have to do if we were writing about many other kinds of places. But it was a good excuse and a good opportunity to marshal and provide my own account of Taiwan's contemporary territoriality through the lens of travel and tourism, and make it a story of a place, but one through mobility. I use this tweet from the journalist Chris Horton, who was writing at that time for the New York Times and still does from time to time. He was at the Summer Universiade, a sports event in Taipei. It's an international sporting event during which even within Taiwan, even hosted within Taipei, the Taiwan team had to compete as Chinese Taipei. In fact, the manual, like the Welcome to Taiwan destination guide, treated Taiwan itself as Chinese Taipei, such that Chinese Taipei is an island that runs from north to south, however many hundreds of kilometers. Chinese Taipei is an island with 24 million people, and so on. It's a very bizarre situation where even Taiwanese authorities, Taiwanese teams are collaborating in this bizarre production of Taiwan as not only a province of China, but as some other figment, in this case, Chinese Taipei. So I use this tweet to distill this. Why reporting on Taiwan isn't easy in one photo. Taiwanese audience in Republic of China Afro-Wigs cheer the arrival of Team Chinese Taipei. I translate this into analytic terms as follows. A people with a consolidated national identity are administered by a dislocated state apparatus that anachronistically shares the territorial referent of the irredentist power that replaced it, symbolically figured by a nationality, Chinese, to which only a dwindling minority subscribes, and imagined to live in a city, Taipei, not inhabited by a majority of the island's residents. The so-called status quo is a strange kind of status indeed. This all sets the stage for chapter 2, which provides a history of mobility, or the lack thereof, between Taiwan and China, first during the Cold War and martial law eras, and then following the 1987 and 1988 openings of limited travel in both directions. It describes how the Chen Shui-bian administration actually attempted to open up to Chinese tourists, but was thwarted by a PRC that collaborated with the KMT through party-to-party talks to bring the latter back to power under a different leadership and nationalist ideology under the catchphrase of the 92 Consensus. This 92 Consensus, interpreted by the KMT as one China, each with its own interpretation, but interpreted by China as simply one China, was the rhetorical basis for China-Taiwan political relations, including tourism, during the 2008 to 2016 presidency of Ma Ying-jeou. And this was a diplomatic fiction that referred to the apocryphal outcome of a series of meetings between the two parties, representatives of quasi-state agencies run directly by the two parties in 1992, which didn't produce any sort of written agreement, but later was said by both sides in different ways to agree that, okay, there's just one China, something like that. And this is how Ma Ying-jeou couched all of his diplomatic relations, including trade deals as well, with China throughout his presidency. And so this sort of temporarily maintained the so-called status quo, however exceptional it is, of Taiwan's de facto independence. It did fuel suspicion in Taiwan that forces on both sides of the strait plan to use state and market mechanisms to enact political unification or even annexation by the PRC. And the 2008 explosion of tourism and the opening of cross-strait direct flights was really probably the most spectacular demonstration of the economic policy of Ma Ying-jeou. Like there wasn't all that much to show right away. People in Taiwan didn't suddenly get rich thanks to the openings, the economic openings provided by this policy, but there really was a quite dramatic effect as flights opened up and as tourists started coming in. Prior to 2008, there were almost no Chinese tourists in Taiwan. The few that did come came through Macau or Hong Kong or other places. But after 2008, cross-strait flights start coming in, first from Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, first-tier cities. Typically, this is not unusual for Taiwan. It's how Chinese tourism opens up to any destination. Soon, second and third-tier cities, first group tours and then independent tours. And very quickly from 2008, 2009, and on, Chinese tourists radically drastically overtake Japanese tourists to become by far the largest tourist segment in Taiwan. And this starts actually transforming a number of spaces in Taiwan. However, it was done under somewhat different performances of sovereignty on both sides. So for example, flying from China to Taiwan, as I did, taking this photo in 2014, when you fly from China to Taiwan, you don't go through an international terminal. You go through an international and Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan terminal. This performs Taiwan as if it's part of this imaginary regional formation. And those of you who are curious to know the history of this imaginary regional formation of Gang-Altai, I recently published an article in the journal Eurasian Geography and Economics called Simulating Territory, the Rise and Demise of an Imaginary Regional Formation of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. This was invented actually in 1998. Gang-Altai didn't exist even as a discursive object until it was invented by policymakers and then projected throughout space and time, projected backwards. Officials who'd never used the phrase, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and so on, the things they said about these territories were reassembled as if they had said Gang-Altai. They never did. And airports throughout China and maps and bookstores and so on with travel sections reassembled themselves to promote the idea that there is such a shared imaginary regional formation as Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. But meanwhile, in Taiwan, I took this photo in Songshan Airport, where I also went stalking Chinese tourists on their way back to, Fuzhou or Shanghai, Hongqiao, or whatever. They're not flying to international plus mainland. They're just flying back somewhere international. So there's a bit of a displacement, a bit of a strange ambiguity and fuzziness about the territoriality of the arriving and sending areas. And to kind of treat that strange kind of fuzziness, not just in the airport, but also in the destinations in Taiwan itself, I borrowed from this book, The City and the City by China Mieville. Has anyone read this book? It's a wonderful work of speculative fiction by a great writer who actually, I don't know if before contemporaneously with a series of wonderfully imaginative books, studied international relations and even earned a PhD in that at LSE. Recently wrote a book revisiting the Communist Manifesto. It's a specter haunting, very, very interesting thinker who has a book called The City and the City, which is a murder mystery. It's kind of a potboiler that is an excuse to set up an interesting geopolitical fantasy in which there are two countries or two cities coexisting, spanning the same space, in which on one side of the street, you see what's in your country and you unsee what's on the opposite side of the street. The city spans not just space laterally, but even buildings such that you're on one floor and you're on one country, you go up another floor, you're in the other country. And if you don't have the right capers, you don't have the right permits or passes, you not only can't travel between them, you actually are learned to see and unsee what is yours and what is not, even though, people look more or less, have similar complexion, they speak similar sounding languages, but maybe with slightly different accents. And I use this book as a way to think through what Chinese tourists see or unsee, as well as what Taiwanese see or unsee within Taiwan. People learn to tactically see or unsee. And for Chinese who have been taught this hegemonic interpretation of Taiwan as a part of China, they see Taiwan reproduced as a part of China on these maps. They see Sun Moon Lake as the representative of Taiwan on the passport page for Taiwan. When they come to Taiwan, they see China, right? But for those who might have learned slightly different things, who've traveled in other places, who maybe get off the circuit of the group tour, go to places like Dulan, go to even some offshore islands, maybe they see something else. So I use this book to kind of set up how Taiwan is there's as many Taiwans as there are eyes to see them, and depending on how Taiwan was framed, they might see or unsee Taiwan in this way. Of course, it's not only tourists. Taiwanese themselves, in different generations, in different ways, and with different educational regimes, have been taught to see and unsee Taiwan as Chinese, Taiwanese, or otherwise. And so tourism kind of throws all of this into view. And so here I again borrow a Foucauldian term of heterotopia to think through as just kind of a conceptual approach to treating where Taiwan's territorial performances start contradicting themselves, both even before tourists, but also particularly more so as tourists arrived. And there are places where this is particularly obvious and particularly explosive. For example, Taipei 101 at the height of Chinese tourism. And this image is what became the cover of the book. Although I blurred out the faces of the particular tourists, I took this image in 2014. And why is this so interesting? So in 2014, and throughout the time Chinese tourists were coming to Taiwan, Falun Gong, a dissident spiritual religious group that had been banned in China for many years and complains of human rights abuses, detention, organ harvesting, and so on. You will find them, in fact, I just saw them today around my NTNU campus. You find them particularly in places where Chinese tourists go. So not so much Taiwan these days, but anywhere else, Bali, Thailand, Hawaii, Paris. And during the heyday of Chinese tourism, anywhere that Chinese tourists went, even very obscure places like random train stations that no one would know to go to, or random commission shops, which I'll talk about in a moment, but particularly Taipei 101, which has long been this symbol of Taiwan's modernity. Being for a time the world's tallest skyscraper, Falun Gong would go and demonstrate there, holding up signs about human rights abuses, exhorting Chinese tourists to abandon the Communist Party, and so on. And they would sit there and meditate. They'd have these very graphic displays. And so that's, one element. Is the kind of thing you can't see in China, right? Now, to come and demonstrate against them came a group called the so-called Concentric Patriotism Association of the ROC, the Aiguo Tongxin Hui, a group of people who you see pictured holding up with the tourists together, ROC flags, as well as PRC flags. Flags, as long as it's Chinese, they're happy. And taking a video of them counter demonstrating against Falun Gong and hanging out with tourists. So they're doing that, kind of performing Taiwan as a part of China. Just out of this frame, in a photo I think I'll show later, comes another group, the Taiwan Independence Revolutionary Army, of Taiwan independence activists, mostly older, but not only, waving flags of Taiwan independence and playing songs in Taiyu about how Taiwan's an independent country. So all in this space, you have a sense of actually multiple sovereignties contending with each other in this kind of superimposed, overlapping way, such that not only tourists, but even Taiwanese people were confused. They weren't sure who was who and who was what. It was a very bizarre kind of raucous scene, and it seemed appropriate, however strange looking on a book, to put on the cover. And so I in this chapter of Taiwan as a Tourist Heterotopia, I tore the reader through sites like 101, but as well as sites like the National Palace Museum, the umbilical cord of the nation. Taiwan is a part of China, or the ROC. As well as sites like Shilin Night Market, a place where we've probably all been to. It's a place where when I first came to Taiwan, Taiwanese friends wanted to take me to eat Taiwanese treats. But by the time of the fieldwork of this book, Taiwanese were complaining it had been taken over by Chinese tourists. They didn't want to go there anymore. If they did go, they'd go later at night when there were fewer tourists. I then take the reader to Dulan, a very different place on the southeast coast in Amis Village, where some independent tourists went and had a very different experience of Taiwan as an island in the Pacific with indigenous people. So I show through this chapter the many different kinds of Taiwan that are experienced not just by people in Taiwan, but particularly transformed for guests in ways that they can selectively see or unsee Taiwan as Taiwanese or Chinese. This all sort of sets the stage for the centerpiece, and what one reviewer called the tour de force of the book, which is a nearly diaristic account of one of the worst weeks of my life. That was circling Taiwan with a Chinese tour group. And for this, I went into a brick and mortar travel agency in Shanghai. I had to go to several travel agencies. The first few wouldn't take me. They wouldn't tell me why. They just said I wasn't Chinese, so I couldn't go. And finally, I found one that would take me, and I paid them like 6,000 RMB, about $900 US, for 8 days of misery. Staying in terrible hotels, eating terrible food that was ostensibly Taiwanese, but was just like the kind of like sanbeizi, like served in a basement in an unmarked building next to Sun Moon Lake, like commission shop after commission shop, supposedly going to a tea museum, but again it was like an excuse to see this guy Ma Yingjiu on a box of tea. And we went to a KMT owned and operated jade store in Hualien. They were very proud to tell us that not only were they KMT, but the more jade we bought, especially if we bought jade that was the same kind of jade shape and size that previous KMT chairs like Lian Zhan or other Pan-Blue affiliated politicians like James Song, if we bought the same kind of vase that they gave to Hu Jintao, a vase that was 1 meter tall for one China and 92 centimeters tall on top of that for the 92 consensus, that Taiwan and China would unify faster. Yeah, so my fellow tourists who were, it's like 5 construction workers from Jiangsu and a Shanghainese family, they weren't impressed by that stuff. In fact, they found that very similar to the kind of stuff they would experience in China, which, if anything, just made Taiwan that much more Chinese for them. I start this chapter with a rhyme that the tour guide said: 上车睡觉，下车尿尿，回家什么都不知道. Get on the bus and sleep, get off the bus and pee, go home knowing nothing. And pretty accurate in some ways. Everywhere we went, the tour guide would go on about how Chinese Taiwan was, Taiwan had been colonized by Japan, but those Japanese people, and he would use slurs against Japanese people. He called them Japanese devils and the like. And occasionally he'd catch my eye as he was doing that, and he'd ask me if this was okay, and I'd just be like, do your thing. He went on and on like this. He said, okay, our premier, Zamen's only, Wen Jiabao, who was the premier of China at the time. And so this is, again, an ROC national. In fact, he was a retired military officer, saying our premier, Wen Jiabao, couldn't come to Taiwan, so you're going to go to the places he'd always wanted to go. In this case, it was the Zhongtai Monastery in central Taiwan and Guoguangshan. Again, a very China-focused Buddhist conglomerate that they found very impressive. Most of the places we went, the tourists were actually not impressed by what they saw. They're like, okay, Sun Moon Lake has nothing on West Lake. Alishan has nothing on Huangshan. This site in China. Hey, but Taiwanese people are kind of nice. And this is kind of similar in some ways to what many independent tourists had to say, and that's the subject of chapter 5. So I start chapter 5 with this guy Han Han, who is a very popular blogger, race car driver, who came and he wrote this thing in 2012, I think, called Winds of the Pacific. Is a blog that went on and on. Actually, he had a very transformational experience in Taiwan. He lost his phone in his taxi cab, and the cab driver came and returned it to his hotel. His glasses broke or something, and he had to go get a new pair made. And he went to a glasses shop, and they didn't have the right stock for him, so they gave him a temporary model. And he's thinking, "Wow, no one would ever be this nice to me in China. Like, I'm about to get mugged. Like this can't be right. I'm being set up for a scam or something." But no, people are just being perfectly nice and returning his phone. And he thought, he writes, this must be actually not because Taiwan is Taiwanese, or I don't know, like maybe it had been Japanese colony, or maybe like for whatever kinds of reasons Taiwanese people might behave in this way. What he interprets this as is Taiwanese are so nice and civilized because they didn't suffer from the Cultural Revolution or other depredations of the Communist Party. In fact, Taiwanese are so great because they're more authentically Chinese than China. He has to thank Hong Kong and Taiwan for preserving Chinese civilization. That's why Taiwan is so nice. So he uses Taiwan to stage this critique of China under the CCP. I contrast this with the account of a tourist I met before she came to Taiwan, a young woman I met at an art gallery in Shanghai, who I stayed in touch with on WeChat as she toured around Taiwan. And she went to Changping, to the 24-hour Esleep bookstore, and she discovered books about the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. She went to a talk by a Hong Kong University professor about the dissident artist Ai Weiwei, pictured here on the right. Stuff that she never would have learned about China had she stayed there. And in some ways, one might think this would be the worst nightmare of the CCP, sending tourists to Taiwan and learning this forbidden knowledge. But these are just 2 accounts of many that I treat in this chapter. I interview dozens of tourists, and some have these experiences of awakening, and some don't care. Some are just here to see their family. There's many people from China have married into Taiwan. Some people just wanted to see their daughters, and so they came here on tourist visas, and they just eat and drink and go home. Other people I meet have other kind of profound experiences too. So I interview people all around Taiwan. I meet them sometimes by just going up and talking to them. Others I met by through friends. Maybe they stayed at a friend's Airbnb. Others I meet at music festivals, and I chat them up. And there's all kinds of funny accounts in here. And they're very hard to kind of classify. So this chapter does that. Chapter 6 moves on to the political. It kind of goes after these ethnographies, and it takes a larger view of the political changes that were happening because of tourism and contemporaneous with tourism. So in 2014, there was the largest protest and social movement in Taiwan's history, the Sunflower Movement, which was a protest against a trade deal, the Services Trade Act with China, which would have, among other things, liberalized tourism further. It would have allowed investment and ownership by Chinese-owned businesses within Taiwan, such that it wouldn't have just been like a Taiwanese company, in the case of the group I went with, that was running the tour, but even a Chinese company could have directly run tours within Taiwan. Of course, other sectors would have been opened up for investment from China, publishing, medicine, and so on. A huge protest took place in 2014 against that. I was there as an action researcher, and it blocked the passage of that bill. Some 7 months later, Hong Kong erupted in the umbrella movement, which was seeking for universal suffrage, for the right to directly elect the chief executive. I went and conducted research there as well. That wasn't explicitly about tourism at all. In fact, it was about the right to vote, but there was much more, I think, anti-tourist sentiment on display. And so I talk about how, to kind of answer this puzzle, why is it that in Taiwan, where the Services Trade Act was actually sort of about tourism in a way, among other things, people weren't talking about tourism very much in that protest, whereas in Hong Kong, people were talking about tourism, even though that wasn't the issue. I discuss these things before moving on to what happened following the Sunflower Movement, which was the absolute electoral collapse of the KMT and the takeover of not only the legislature, but the presidency by the DPP. So the legislature for the very first time. So it was basically a thorough repudiation of Ma's China-centric economic policies, including tourism. So this led to President Tsai's disavowal of the 92 consensus, her promotion of something called the Taiwan consensus, basically letting Taiwanese people determine their own future. And in response, China cut back drastically on tourism. Group tourism in particular collapsed, leading to unprecedented protests by the the Taiwan tourism industry, especially those who were reliant on Chinese tourism. And so, being a good ethnographer, I went and I joined them for this tour. I put on their hat, and I went to go, as you can see on the right here, to go welcome mainland tourists to tour Taiwan. And so the Chinese, the tourism industry demanded a bailout. They demanded that Tsai Ing-wen reavow the 92 consensus. They had all these signs about Taiwan and China being part of one family, and so on. 10,000 people went and protested. This is in September 2016. But their position was not all that popular. It was very much in the minority. And rather than drop Taiwan's right to self-determination, Tsai instead arranged for bailouts, basically giving cash to a number of these agents that had gotten very reliant on Chinese tours, while also marketing Taiwan not only for Chinese tourists, but for Southeast Asian, Japanese, South Asian, and other kinds of tourists. And in fact, it worked well enough that overall tourism numbers continued rising throughout her term, even if money was directed into different circuits. And so with the disappearance of a lot of, particularly the more concentrated Chinese tour groups, a number of Taiwanese actually celebrated their reclamation of public space by putting out these snarky ads, which I pulled from PTT, the bulletin board system. Welcome to Taiwan without Chinese, with these kinds of idyllic images, which were, a lot of Taiwanese found this amusing. The Taiwan Tourism Bureau, even under a DPP administration, didn't. They said this doesn't reflect well in Taiwan. We should still be friendly to everyone. As numbers continued dropping, KMT officials from the remaining cities and counties at that time, and at that time there weren't so many, Taoyuan, Nantou, Miaoli, flew to China to promote their cities and counties and collaborated with travel agents to do a 92 consensus tour, a blue tour of Taiwan, which divided Taiwan into this strange kind of half donut shape. It was a bit difficult. I mean, Taoyuan actually, of course, was a DPP run at that time, and almost everyone's flying into Taoyuan or Kaohsiung. So it was very hard to pull this off, and not many people took up these tours, but it did show that Taiwan was very much being divided into two Taiwans in a very different sense. Still with Tsai's landslide re-election in 2020, it looked as if the more plural of the two Taiwans had eclipsed the other in the face of the red sun across the strait, when, of course, COVID hit, bringing cross-strait traffic, which was already diminished, to a complete standstill, and thrusting Taiwan's contested sovereignty to the center of world attention. And this is something I treat in the epilogue. I discussed that episode, which probably many of us have lived through, for better or worse, and show how Taiwan, even if it was its time to shine in terms of its incredibly effective public health management, at least for the first couple of years, it did come out in precarious a situation as ever. I then turn in the epilogue to show, of course, I recapitulate some of the arguments in the book before considering how both tourists and Taiwan nationalists share this kind of similar predicament, which I name, following the late critic Lauren Berlant, as one of cruel optimism. Tourists, they seek pristine, they seek this sense of recreation, of joy, even as they go to places that they are often aware they're despoiling. They want to often go to get away from other tourists, but the more they go, the more they're on other tourists. There's this sense that they can never quite reach that summit they're trying to go for. And I think about this alongside a T-shirt I saw worn by one of those Taiwan Independence Revolutionary Army activists, which was "Taiwan independence will solve everything." I think that's also kind of a really optimistic sentiment. It's certainly, I don't think, up to the CCP to decide Taiwan's future, but the idea that independence will solve everything is a fantasy, right? There's other sorts of problems that will come up, and that's, of course, for people here to decide. There's as if COVID has shown anything, it's that nation state territorial sovereignty is no solution to anything. And so I think about these things alongside each other, as well as alongside the looming environmental threats that tourism facilitates. As much as tourism transforms and performs state territory, even just in social terms, as plane travel recommences, as carbon outputs continue rising, so do sea levels rise, so does territory continue reforming in ways yet to be realized. And that's how the book closes and how I'll close my talk. Thank you very much, and I can't wait to hear the discussant.
Thanks a lot. It was a very beautiful talk, and I didn't say that, but yeah, I recommend everyone to read the book, because it's also a beautiful ethnography of tourism. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Benjamin Taunay, so our discussant. Benjamin is an assistant professor at Angers University and at the Joint Institute with Ningbo University. He's a specialist of Chinese tourism, and he wrote a book on China internal tourism.
Should we put him on screen?
We don't see him. Why don't we see him? Yeah, just wait.
But I'm there.
Yes, we have him on screen. And also on beach sightseeing in China. So thanks a lot to Benjamin for coming today. So I will give him the floor to discuss your book. And for those who are present here, I will try to give you a bit of sound with the mic. So yeah, you can start.
Okay. Thanks, Nathaniel. Is it clear for everyone? I mean, everyone can hear me? Perfect. No. Okay, so thanks a lot, Nathaniel, for inviting me today. And then thanks Ian for this really exciting talk and fantastic book. As you did, maybe I should do a self-introduction about myself, because I think we share a lot in common. And so, as Nathaniel says, I'm associate professor in France, and I've got a background researching Chinese domestic tourism. And as you, I was living in Guilin from 2005 until 2007. So maybe we have been crossing together at the time. Why should I say this? Because you said in your book you have got a Taiwan point of view. Maybe I should say I've got a China point of view. I spent many years in there. But at the same time, I did 3 research fields in Taiwan in 2016, 17, 18, about surfing dissemination, surfing diffusion from Japan to Taiwan and to Hainan. And at that time, I went to 2 specific places. One was Taucheng in the northeast, near Ilan, and the other places was Kenting, of course, in the southeast, where you talk about so many tourists go. And at that time, I got an experiences that left its mark on me. It was on November 17 in Baisha Bay, Baisha Haitan. It was exactly as you said. It was, I would say, a Chinese scenic spot because of the planning of the site, because of the amenities, because of the accommodation, and so on. Everything was so Chinese. And at that time, there were only Chinese tourists with large buses, waiting for them at the entrance. Is it still okay or no? Yeah, okay, perfect. And as you say in your book, it was, I would say, a full culturally Chinese register at the background. On that place specifically, this is a film, but this is also a song, the song of Pan Anbang, Grandma's Pan Hu Bei, which is in Chinese, Waipo Pan Hu Ban, which is 1979 song. And all the tourists can singing, say a few words, describe it, make it in relation to the place where we were visiting it. And at that time, I was wondering, about the influence of the Chinese urban tourism on these kind of sites, the way of exoticizing places in Taiwan, but also the effects of on Chinese urban tourism on local economy, because previous to 2017, the site was closed, then it was reopened, and then it was reclosed. So I was thinking, especially, as you said, in the context of post-Tsai Ing-wen election. And about all these points, your book gave me a lot of insight, inputs, and a lot of answers to my questions. So first, thank you so much, because I was really waiting for that kind of book for years. And so on introduction, I should say this is a book full of qualities. It is, of course, for specialists, but it's also for larger audience. I mean, some people with interest on international relations, Chinese urban tourism, Taiwan society, tourism studies, and so on. It's easy to read. It's well structured in 6 chapters. Maybe we'll talk about this. Maybe I would have done in another way, but it's really complete with list of abbreviation, index, and so on. Also, this is a multidisciplinary book that draws on geography, philosophy, anthropology, political science. At one time, I was wondering in which field do you stand? Because that's really rare, but some people, some scholars can get all these fields all together. And I also noticed about your mathematics background, about one verb, which is instantiate. I've been searching from English to French and from French to French, because in French it says instancier. I said, okay, what is instancier? This is something from coding, and you use it as a metaphor, as a code for the Chinese tourists when they visit. And it's really I really like it. And as a geographer, I really like when you say on page 50, I quote, "My ethnographic attentions privilege specialty. And this is really rare when anthropology and geography are linked together. And also, last but not least, this, I think your idea on page 5, an introduction, when you say that the central conceptual proposition of this book is that tourism performs and can transform state territory, we say, wow, finally, punctuation. So it's really a complete and comprehensive book where you use not only a research field, but 20 years of your experiences in China, as you said, in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. So I truly recommend it to my colleagues and to audience to read it. So for the discussion, I will try to do an analytical reading by pairs of chapters. I mean, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, with a few questions on each. Because I think maybe it's because of my French scholar background, you know, it can be linked in 3 parts. As you know, French people like to do 1, 2, 3. And I think maybe you can group it as framework, then ethnography, and then comparison and opening. But we can discuss about this later. And more generally, I'm going to address 3 kinds of questions. First will be about tourism and Chinese tourism. Second will be about what you call the close ties between ideologies, nationalism, and business. And the last will be maybe what I would talk about, the many China. You said many Taiwans, but can we say that China is a whole? It's something like unified? I don't think so, and I would like to exchange with you. So first, on chapter 1 and 2, I think these are 2 extremely useful and valuable chapters. You said that maybe for a Taiwanese or for Taiwan specialists, it's quite boring, but for me, it was really useful because it gave the framework to understand the many Taiwans and why you use the S at Taiwan, to understand the contemporary situation, to understand how divided is the society. And you can feel it, you can look at it, as you said, in the territoriality. So this is not only the North or the South. This is not the Chinese National Party or the Democratic Progressive Party. This is not Aboriginal people versus mainlanders background. This is much more than this. And as you said on page 46, Taiwan itself harbors multiple, ambiguous, contradictory, and competing state territorialization programs. So this is not, if there is an effect of Chinese outbound tourism on Taiwan, this is not only because of China, this is also because of Taiwan. And this is really useful to understand it at first sight. Then on chapter 2, I would say it's really useful, I would say better important input for the tourism studies. And I wish a lot of my colleagues, students, PhD students look at it, because as you say, tourism is not a peaceful instrument. As you said in your presentation, it does not promote peace. And as you, I think, page number 2, this is a geopolitical instrument that transforms state territory. Then page number 9, you said, and I think it's really true, it's a political technology of state territorialization. And then in page 10, I think we should insist on this, we should emphasize on this. This is a modality of state violence, domination, and difference making. So definitely this is not to cohabit or to be all together peacefully in one place. Maybe I would say you could use the work of Tony Tse, which is a scholar based in Hong Kong, which is the first, in my mind, in 2011, that used the term of geopolitical stake of tourism gazing to Taiwan. On that way, I really like your example about Pacific countries, about Canada, at page 37, when you say that it take 18 ministerial visit to China and a change into a more pro rhetoric and position through for China. At that time, if in my memories, I remember that Air Canada, the airway company, it has to change all the map in its plane in appears that Taiwan will be on the map of PRC, of People's Republic of China. But I think at that specific point, that maybe you can emphasize and go deeper onto that point. Because as you said, from the China point of view, there is 3 ministries for the framework of Chinese outbound tourism. This is Foreign Affairs, Public Security, China National Tourism and Estimation. But you should, or maybe you may, mention that the CNTA became in 2018 the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in China. So about the cultural authority, as Palmieri said, this is really important to notice it because it leads a lot of changes. So maybe I would say you can go deeper about when you talk about the Chinese public agencies and more about the stakeholders. Maybe can you open the box, tell a little bit more about this situation, because I will tell it later, China is not a war. It's not a unified situation. There's a lot of negotiations, and there's a few books in the last year talking about this. When decisions come from the top, it has different effects during the implementation because of the local stakeholders. And this maybe has consequences on Chinese outbound tourism. But we'll talk about this later. On chapter 2, I think there's another really important input. It's what you talk about the link between politics, ideologies, and economy. Because as I note on page 44, you said if you are not aligned with the Kuomintang status policy, that can lead, I quote, to the bankruptcies of several travel agents. And as you say, these enterprises are like cartels, and the word is quite strong with mainlanders' background. I would ask you, and how can we go deeper in this logic for further researches? I mean, above the example, can we use a new framework to think about this? Because, and can you give us recommendation from your own research? Okay, so let's move to chapter 3 and 4. As Nathaniel, I really like your ethnography part. I think it's really excellent. And there's a lot of discuss, much more than we can do today. Because as I said, you value speciality, territories, places, sites, and its instruments. You are going to use a new concept, the territorial translation with the political terminology. And like this, you help us to stand on both sides of the strait, on Taiwan and in China. And with your ethnography, I really can feel, I mean, inside and with the Chinese tourists. And I found many similarities. For example, in chapter 3, when you use Foucault's Heterotopia, on my mind, when I'm thinking about China, People's Republic of China, I use Foucault another book, which is Discipline and Punish, 1975, because this is another state, I would say. So I really like it because this is word within word, space within the society, but with different rules. And as you say on page 47, and you demonstrate in your presentation, most of them, especially the group you have been with, they said that they felt as if they were still in their home country. And the part about familiarity and friction and the performances you show in your presentation, in your book, are really excellent. But maybe I would like to address one question. Can you go deeper about what you call the sensory differences? Because as you know, and as we know, the Chinese tourists in China and abroad, they are quite gênants. And you know what is gênant, of course. So how to conciliate, how to put together this Chinese gênant in these sites with the Taiwanese, or describe as it, Wenzhou, which is peaceful or something. How to put it together, gênant and Wenzhou. I would like also to address another question about the Chinese outbound tourism, because on page 49, I quote that you say Taiwan fits into a larger pattern of outbound Chinese tourist destination that has found themselves adjusting their visual and cultural landscape to meet the desires of the world's largest national market. I think that's really true. If you go to Southeast Asia countries, you will find this. But you also find that most of the time, especially in Thailand, I would say, they don't usually, the Chinese tourists, mix with other tourists. And I would like to ask you, what is the difference, or what is the specificity of Taiwan, or the case of Taiwan? Is there, or have you been thinking or not about this, about making comparison with other cases, just to go out of the Taiwan case about conflict, as you said, to Scrapper 101, the role of the diaspora, and more broadly, what is the place of Taiwan in the PRC plan? I mean, when the PRC as a whole at that time used tourism in order to increase its influence on the world. It has a plan. It has a plan not only on Taiwan, not on Southeast Asia, but on the whole world. And what is the place? Or maybe as later, is it the first, the last, in the middle? What can you say the place of Taiwan in this plane? And last on this chapter, can you give us more explanation about what I would call the mini China? Because I understand one China is about the 1992 consensus, but since you use the word cross-strait, can we look from both sides and think China not as a wall? I give you two examples, page 52 and page 70. Page 52, you said, the territorial socialization engendered by the PRC education. What is PRC education? Has been for producing effect of PRC stateness. What is PRC stateness for Chinese visitor in Taiwan? And on page 70, in the same way, you talk about the PRC's insistent claims. So what is the PRC? And can you discuss not as a wall? I'll just give you one example. I've got a PhD student who graduated 2 years ago, and he was working on the travel agencies in Wuhan. And what he demonstrates is the travel agency they have to deal between the will of the tourist and the will of the national government, because there is regulation, there is directive, there is law, and you have to do with them. But at the same time, the Chinese tourists, they wish to go off the beaten track, I would say. So they're trying to find solution, and there's more and more local travel agencies blooming for this kind of tourists. At the same time, can you tell us maybe more about the limits of the propaganda? Because propaganda in China, or social control, is not a wall. You said, for example, on page 61, you give a photo of a Chinese passport with the sun, moon, lake, asserting that they have been learning this from. So this is true. But do some tourists take their distances from this propaganda? And do you have some references about some scholars about China social control? I think it's maybe, but this discussion may be a little bit more complex. On chapter 4, on the different stages you talk, as I said, there's many similarities with domestic tourism, about nationalism in the discourses and within sites, about shopping, as you said, and of course about rhythm and the sentences you quote, 上去睡觉, 下去尿尿, 回家什么都不知道. Of course, it's exactly the same in China. But my question is not there. My question is about, of course, I think you are waiting for this question, about the representativeness of your case, because you use, of course, one tool. You said it's quite difficult to get accepted by the agencies. But on page 76, I quote, you say, apart from basic vocational and technical training, no one in the group had a post-secondary school education. So my question is, do 4 people from Shanghai and 5 workers from the north of Jiangsu province can represent all the variety of discourses and practices we can find in China? For example, as you said, Subei, the north of this Jiangsu province, it's really pejorative. It's like the far countryside of China. And why did not, or maybe you tried, but I didn't find it in the book, to attempt to other tools, of course, except the prices and the difficulty to get accepted into, as I said. In fact, in this chapter, I would have linked, maybe, but you cannot you can disagree with this group through description with the what you tell us in chapter 5 about the independent tourists. Because first, chapter 5 is quite short, but that's not the main point. But what one of your results is that the independent also will for the reunification. So there's not so much difference. They would say, as you said, our premier Wen Jiabao. But I'm not sure all are the same. I mean, from my Chinese point of view, I can disagree with this. I think all the people, and I don't know about the representativeness of this case, but we can talk about this. Meanwhile, as I said previously, when I talk about chapter 3, maybe, as I said, maybe I would link all the development, or what you call on the close tie between politics, ideologies, and business in another chapters, or maybe on a larger epilogue at the end of the book. I think this is a fundamental part, but maybe this is out of the topic, and you can answer this. Because some of the stakeholders got benefits, but as you said, some of them got detrimental. I quote to station by 19, page 99, those were not aligned on the Kuomintang support, I mean, way of thinking, they won't get any tourists. And page 90, I found another really interesting thing about when you said on the shop that at the entrance it features photo of Chiang Kai-shek and other Taiwanese Kuomintang leaders, but as well as images of Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao. And I think this is a whole new field of research to consider, and that's why I think maybe, and said maybe, we can put it elsewhere in the book. I mean, I really like your plan into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but maybe we can do in another way. And then last, on chapter 5 and 6, I would say, according to me, it's more uneven. I mean, the chapter 5, as I said, is maybe the less convincing part. I would prefer chapter 6. And as I said, this development could be perhaps reshaped, replaced. For example, in chapter 5, I really like the development about what you call the effective qualities of space, page 105, when you talk about Xiao Qingxin. which is really famous in China also. But some others, I think, are a little bit far from the core of your book. For example, the youth music culture, but maybe Nathaniel won't agree because this is his field. I would maybe have discussed more on what you call the apolitical regender on page 116, when you say that the nominal opening of independent leisure tourism extended and co-opted all the forms of permitted travel. I would say the link was really exciting to think, but you said that maybe this is only a few amendments in the travel and tourism between the two sides of the strait. In fact, in this chapter, I was really waiting since the general introduction about what you call on page 101, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, worst nightmare. Because the results of your research for me is quite like a paradox. I was thinking that, for the Chinese Communist Party, it would be really dangerous to open the doors to independent tourists, because they can find that this is what they see, what they listen, what they feel, what they sense in China is fake. But in fact, you said not. But again, don't you think this is because of your interviews? Or maybe can you talk a little bit more about the structures of China and its division according to the opening to the Chinese independent tourists? I mean, the opening has been done gradually by group, by range of cities. For example, a few years ago, people living in Guilin cannot go as independent tourists in Taiwan, but from Nanning, you can. From Shanhui, from the province, the main city, you can. Maybe you can do the link and you do it with the civilization concept, Wenming, of the quality, 素质, of the people and the will to, once again, make the link a little bit more with Chinese side and go more deeper in, I would say, Chinese slogans, propaganda, the way of asserting it, and so on. And maybe I would have done, but I think it's quite difficult to go deeper in the interview by making it footnotes on your books about the background of the tourists themselves in more a sociological way. I mean, about the holiday records in China, holiday records abroad, the life in China, just to better interpret who they are and why do they act as this. But once again, I have to say this is really difficult to stand on both sides of the strait. And if it was me, I think I won't be able the same looking Taiwan from China. So it's quite difficult. So it's just a few proof for the discussion. And last, for the chapter 6, as you said in your presentation, Taiwanese didn't get rich with Chinese tourism. Maybe I wish in this chapter, which is, I really like it, I wish a little bit more of statistic tables. I just find it one in your book in order to show or to dismantle the discourse of the Kuomingdong about the importance of Chinese outbound tourism in Taiwan. Because as you said, I found two information, page 121, when one institution said in 2013 that this tourism can only deliver less than 0.03% of gross domestic product. And then page 136, when you say that the whole outbound tourism in Taiwan account only for 1.8% of Taiwan gross domestic product. So I'm not an addict of economic or table, but I think it can give more input to your development. And my last question that you already answered in your presentation at the beginning, when you do the comparison with Hong Kong, and when you say that you were there during the umbrella movement, I was wondering about your own position, because I said you didn't tell us in the book why you were there. I mean, were you there to support the movement or for your research? But you said, okay, this is for my research. So when I read your book, I was wondering, how do you stand towards PRC, People's Republic of China? But you already answered. So maybe you can have done this, your own presentation, as many anthropologists, ethnologists do in their own book, just to present themselves. As you said, you were a guide, tour guide, and then tour director in Guilin, and these ideas come from this. This is some of the things I asked my PhD students, just to tell more about their professional, intellectual background, just in order to avoid such question as mine today. So in conclusion, I would say one again, despite all these small critics and small, I would say, sub-question, this is a truly, really, really good books, and really like it. And I'm really going to recommend it to the audience and to my colleagues and students. It's really useful to understand the contemporary Taiwans with the ACE. It's really useful for the international relation. And maybe you didn't talk of this in your presentation, but I would like to ask you your point of view about the next elections in next January, because I think it's already started. I was reading in the news, in the newspaper at lunch today, something about Kuomintang position and Democratic Party position about the nuclear and the green energy and replacement or not, and something. I think your book also is really required for tourism studies, for scholars and for graduate students, because we have to say that tourism is a political phenomenon, and not only in Taiwan or in China or from China, but also elsewhere in the world, and I would say anywhere, and maybe especially in earlier democracies. As I'm French, look at French situation actually. And maybe one last question. I was wondering, when I finished your book, in fact, did the tourism help to keep the status quo? Because, or did it help to construct, to build, to fabric a strongest Taiwan society? Because as you mentioned in your conclusion, Taiwan without Chinese tourists is more Wenzhou, quiet, and they've seen it. But in 2008, as the beginning, a large part of society were for the closer relation between the two sides of the strait. So maybe tourism in that way was really useful. Okay, and of course on mainly China, I ask a lot. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. That was really exciting. I really like it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Benjamin, for your question and this discussion of the book. So what we can do now is you can respond to it, or we can take the question and respond all together. What do you prefer?
I'm happy either way. Yeah. Maybe, I mean, the audience has been sitting here so politely. Maybe
give the yeah. So we're gonna give the mic to the audience now. So if you and I will also check the questions.
Maybe one or two from the audience, and then I respond to Benjamin, and then two, and then we go from there.
Sure. Yeah. That's a good thing. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. And yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I just had one question about you were mentioning this tour guide was saying and that kind of made me wonder about do you have any ideas about the sociological profiles of the tour guides for Chinese tourists in Taiwan? So from what I understood, you were saying the guide was from Taiwan, from the military. So is that something that you observe regularly, or I mean, is there any way also, like, how does one learn to cater for Chinese tourists as a process, I would say, and how does one make it a career as a Taiwanese, and why? So I was kind of wondering about that.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much also for the talk. That was really, really interesting. I would have actually so many questions. Try to restrain myself a bit. First, I just wanted to comment about the fact that I found that I just discovered the book today. And I found it was very interesting to me because I think Cornell University Press just published 1 year or 2 years ago the book from Moya Jun, Travel Culture, where she deals with the way like nationalists during the Republican era, especially the 30s, used some early domestic tourism or travel as a way to incorporate margins of the new Republic. And she also deals with the first Chinese tourism coming to Taiwan, especially after 1945, and how tourism has been used a bit as a way to help decolonizing Taiwan from the Japanese, but also on how, and I think like it does make an echo also to your talk, like how some Chinese also were suspicious about the what Japanese culture would have left and how it would have shaped Taiwanese after the Chinese lost the control of the territory. So for me, it was really great to have this like echo and perspective. Just one, let's say 2 questions. The first would be maybe very just like about figures also, as it has been mentioned before. Do you have an idea about how many Chinese tourists were coming to Taiwan with, maybe it's in the book, I don't know, were coming to Taiwan with group tour, and how many were just coming like as independent? How much does it represent? And my further question would be like more also about an open discussion, but about this kind of opposition you introduced at the beginning between the Western Euro-American tourists searching for, let's say, authenticity, and the fact that, according to you, Chinese tourists were not looking for that kind of authenticity. I think it's a really fascinating question. Also, it's also a very complex and difficult question, and it would be difficult for me to talk about Chinese tourists as such like a essentialist category like that. And for my, sorry, I don't want to take the mic too long, but I've been working a bit about Chinese tourists coming to West Africa, especially in Kenya, and met several like Chinese tour guide organizing safaris, and how they were presenting and shaping Chinese tourism and Chinese glance at the safaris and like the kind of unspoiled nature they could discover, and how actually Chinese tourism was also using some Western references in the way like a national park, how Westernizers would look at nature. So well, it's always something. I mean, I would like to have some more insights from your side about this question, whether Chinese tourists are not looking for authenticity when they are traveling, because I'm not sure, especially about what Moya Jun wrote also during the Republican era. it's very, it's very important for Chinese traveler inside the domestic area when they are doing domestic tourism, how they are talking about Mongols, the Tibetans, Hui, Muslim people, with that kind of very folkloric and authentic Chinese people that have been unspoiled, like compared to the urban population from the East. So yeah, just some insight. And thank you very much.
Should we?
Yeah, we can start responding, and then we take another round.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Benjamin, for an incredibly deep and generous read, and thank you both for really great questions. I'm gonna somehow think how to answer all of these. I guess I'll go in reverse order if that's all right. First off, like I wish, for example, that I knew about Moya Jun's book before it was published. I suppose she was under review at a similar time at the same press. And it would be really nice if our editors were on the ball or we were in touch, because I didn't know of her work, and her book was published, I think, just a few months before mine. And it's entirely possible we would have had interesting conversations that could have worked their way to make each book that much richer. We've actually not been in touch, I think, beyond maybe some tweets or something. So I'm looking forward to thinking more about how to incorporate her discoveries into the book. Another thing about the timeline of the book writing, as Benjamin pointed out, there could have been a very interesting discussion, as you observe, about the renaming of the Ministry of Tourism and Culture. That's something that happened when the book was already, I think, under review. And I could have, as I, of course, because it went through several stages, to have thought that through more deeply and put that into a revision. I could have, I think, expanded on that really acute observation of yours, because it is worth a little more attention, I think. To the question or the about just now, and sorry, what's your name? Raphael. To Raphael's question about authenticity, whether Chinese tourists are in search of it or not. I'm not the first person to suggest that they're not all that interested in authenticity. As Benjamin cited as well, the work of the anthropologist Palmieri, I think he's made this work most acutely and maybe earliest in the, I don't know, 2006 or 7 or something, with his book Scenic Sites or Scenic Spots, something like that. And you've probably read his work as well. There was, when I started this work, there was so little ethnographic work on Chinese tourists, particularly outside of China. There's a bit of work on Chinese tourists in minority regions in China. Some by, for example, my PhD advisor, Tim Oakes, a geographer, some work by Louisa Shine, some work by Susan Blum, in, I think, anthropology as well. So thinking about authenticity, or also the staging of Han as like more advanced, more modern, often more masculine, work that has also lent itself to a field that kind of came and went of critical Han studies, borrowing from critical whiteness studies in the U.S. in the U.S. context. And those, I think, tackle this question of whether or not Chinese tourists are looking for authenticity domestically within, again, like a greater China, or a China that is recognized as if not subject to what some have called, for example, Drew Gladney or Louisa Shine have called internal or Orientalism, at least something that is referred to as using, like late 19th century Chinese nationalist terms like 中华民族, which are still with us and still being recited as ad nauseum. So like whether or not Chinese tourists are out for authenticity or not, I think it varies. I think, for example, Nyeri, like his work was at a particular time and place. I think the work, and I'm curious to know more about what you've uncovered in West Africa, might have different things to say about that. And group tourists versus independent tourists also, I think, have different sensibilities as well. And that gets to questions, I guess, of the sociological profile of the tourists and the guides too. Sure, absolutely. More details about the independent tourists and footnotes, I think, would be interesting, particularly for specialists. I suppose, as I was whittling this book down, of course, it was a thoroughly rewritten dissertation, and there's rather more detail on everything, including some like yet a whole other chapter on theory I took out for better or worse, to make this a bit more readable to a very broad audience. And with that, I guess I'll address the two things, one about my discipline and another about methodology. So first, I think Benjamin asked me, what is my discipline? As a bachelor's student, I went through a bunch of different disciplines, just like what was ever kind of appealing at the time before deciding math was very beautiful. And it probably informed the way I think, but the more I studied math, the fewer people I could talk to, and learning Mandarin Chinese was the opposite. The more Mandarin I learned, I could, talk to a whole lot more people. And later, I picked geography as a discipline on the suggestion of actually a Chinese literature professor who I informally studied with as an undergrad, Christopher Connery, basically saying to him, hey, I'm a bit of a dilettante. I have a wide variety of interests. What can accommodate someone who changes their mind a lot? And he said, geography, it's a good Marxist discipline. You should do that. And as I was shopping around, having worked in tourism, looking for disciplines where I might make a persuasive case to get into graduate school, because I hadn't done graduate study. I hadn't done any kind of university study for 10 years. It seemed like indeed geography was a place I could pitch a tent, as it were, and as I did later during the umbrella movement, and I'll get to that in a moment. So as a geography grad student, as someone who likes being out in the field, perhaps more than some other geographers, I found that ethnography was a good methodology for me. I liked I like to kind of write about what I know to a certain point, and maybe address my positionality as much as is safe to do. And there are times when addressing my positionality somewhat more obliquely, in the case of my social movement research, which is the kind of conversation to be saved maybe for another occasion. It's something I've written about in some venues, and prefer maybe to speak about offline. So that's about where my discipline is. But I've been being someone who's kind of interested in boundaries. I like to cross them. I did do my PhD in geography, but while doing my fieldwork, I was affiliated here at Sinica with the Institute of Sociology as a pre-doc. And I had some support from the Fulbright Foundation and later from the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. Through that time, I was affiliated in the Institute of Sociology. So my thinking was influenced a bit by interacting with sociologists here in Taiwan, while also doing geography as a graduate student and taking a wide variety of classes, including sociolinguistics. With Kira Hall, I had a sociolinguist on my committee, and I think taking that class made me particularly attentive to how the territorial terminology of the tour guides, when they would use mainland-inflected accents, mainland-inflected territorial terms, I was paying that much more attention to how they were indexing a certain kind of spatial imaginary. And I'm pleased that the sociolinguist agreed to be on my committee. It was the first time they'd done that for a geographer. As a postdoc, I came back to Sinica and I affiliated at the Institute of Ethnology. So I became sort of an anthropologist for a year before moving to Singapore, where I again I sort of became an imposter in sociology. I was teaching both geography as well as sociology for 5 years in Singapore. And now that I've left Singapore and now I've come back to Taiwan, I am now a professor of literature somehow. In the meantime, I took on a sideline. I edited a volume of literature of the authoritarian era based on work I'd done on transitional justice. And now I'm actually teaching literature and editing some books of literature. And I do some literary translation too. So anyway, I'm basically undisciplined. And I think, or I say multidisciplinary because that sounds pompous, but like undisciplined. And that's informed the way I've written this book, hopefully in a way that is as accessible as possible to as many people, while also bringing in insights from different fields. Now, when I started this work, tourism studies had almost no interest in geopolitics. And I'm pleased to say that that's changed. There has been a self-described geopolitical turn in tourism studies, so much that there is a edited volume called Tourism Geopolitics, co-edited by Mary Mustafanejad in Hawaii, herself, like, trained as an anthropologist, but since then has become a geography professor, and she works on Thailand and other places, and she's all over the place in terms of what she's up to. Very sprawling resume. But she, Jamie Gillen, a geographer now doing global studies in New Zealand, and other people have sort of helped to consolidate tourism as a geopolitical project. A recent special issue in the journal Geopolitics, where I have an article that addresses something you mentioned, Air Canada not only changing its maps to reflect Taiwan as a part of China, but something I attend to in that article called Booking Engines as Battlefields, how a few years ago, China sent a bunch of very threatening notices to a whole lot of airlines, everywhere from Australia to the US to Canada to Europe, forcing all of these airlines to list Taiwan as a province of China. Of course, it's not just booking engines that do this. This is on all sorts of designations of Taiwan and what I call code space. This is something in a journal, Geopolitics, that just came out a year ago. So happily, tourism studies, I think, has caught up to this point, this thing that we both agree on, that tourism is a fundamentally geopolitical project. And I'm happy to say that my work has made the point ethnographically and provides something of a theoretical framework for making sense of why that is the case. Now, about my methodology, I didn't mention in the talk, but I do mention in the book that it wasn't just that one group tour where I circled Taiwan, that I had time with group tours. In chapter 3, and I should have mentioned this in the talk, I did actually join a few other group tours, but only for a day. Each of those tours was for a day. It's really, really, really hard to get on these group tours without being a customer. And so I spent a whole lot of time, and that was when I was here in the Sociology Institute, doing as much networking with tour guides as I could, and asking, hey, can you let me on the bus? I'd love to see what you're up to. And you know, most of them were, I think, very understandably reluctant to let me do so, right? You know, their jobs are at stake, and they don't want to upset their tourists. And sometimes they're taking around people who are ostensibly on leisure tours, but are actually here on business or on politics. And this is, again, why it's very hard to give reliable statistics, because people might say why they're here, but they're here for all kinds of other reasons. So as far as joining those one-day tours, I joined, there was one tour guide who was very generous to let me join a few different day tours of Taipei with him. He was a very different kind of tour guide than the one of my 8-day group tour. This guy who let me join in Taipei, and it's mostly guys who were tour guides. So there's exceptions. It was mostly guys. This guy was not like a Chinese nationalist in the same way. He was just, as far as I could tell, like middle-class Taiwanese guy, I think probably from a Bansang background, who was careful not to say anything that would offend or provoke the tourists, but didn't make a point of going on about our premier Wen Jiabao, and didn't say racist things about Japanese people. But he, you know, the stuff that he did, and the stuff that the Chinese nationalist tour guide, who was a retired military officer living on a pension, who, you know, is pretty generous pension, right? He didn't really need this money, but he was happy to have some extra money, and he enjoyed hanging out with Chinese people. And he was ideologically really into China. He was a member of a kind of a far-right Chinese nationalist group called the Xintong Menghui, that had connections to United Front groups that would bring over Taiwanese to China on these kind of very special political tours. So he had both a financial and a kind of a political interest in this that is not, I think, not representative of a lot of tours and tour guides. But the way that he conducted the tour and the way that this guy in Taipei conducted the tours were close enough. Performing Taiwan more or less in a palatable way that would not accentuate Taiwanese difference. Maybe it's like, you know, maybe like a slightly exotic, culturally distinct, but politically not all that different kind of part of Greater China, something like that. So it wasn't just this one group tour. It was actually several group tours, but the most extensive, of course, was that 8-day group tour. Those one-day tours, those tourists were college educated. They're probably, I think they were wealthier. Most of those were from Shanghai and Beijing and first-tier cities. So I did get something of a swath there. And also, I did spend so much time in places like Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall and other places watching group tours come and go and observing tour guides speaking. So I did get a sense, even if I wasn't doing that kind of nothing that could really be called mobile ethnography in that sense. I mean, the 8 days was, I think, fair to call that ethnography. It's ethnography, what constitutes an ethnographic field site, and how much time do you need to spend? Anthropologists will say, forever. Geographers, are a bit more flexible about that typically. In any event, it wasn't just that one group tour. There are a few others, but there's only so much one ethnographer can do and say, and this is where statistics might be a bit more useful to get a sense of the bigger picture. And it's where I wish there were better statistics available. There are a few figures, facts and figures, and a few tables in the book, but very few, because as I note in the book, most of them are nonsense. Like the estimates that the government officials cited about how much tourists spent per day are fabricated. These are consultancies that were hired by, I don't know, the Ministry of Transportation and Communication in Taiwan. They hired some outside consultancies to go and ask tourists on their way out, how much do you think you spent per day? And they would say, something like $225 a day, something like that. And so this is something that the government officials like to say, hey, this is so much money being spent. But I wasn't able to find, I don't think there is any comprehensive audit of how much was actually spent based on analyzing hotel receipts, commission shop receipts, and the like. I think it's unknown, and I was not in a position to go gather better data on that. And it'd be nice if there was such a thing. Relatedly, how many people were coming as group tourists versus independent tourists? Again, it's not clear. There is the Ministry of the Interior keeps statistics on arrivals to Taiwan by purpose, visit, conference, visiting a relative, or so on. Even that stuff is suspect. I say this because in 2016 and 2017, as China started limiting particularly group tours, they did this implicitly. They didn't announce it right away. They started telling travel agencies to not let so many people come on group tours. And this was verbal. There's verbal instructions. And I verified this with my contacts in China, with travel agents in China who would talk to me anonymously about this. And I didn't just verify it with them. This was also reported in Taiwanese media. And these reports were probably correct. Because the PRC wouldn't allow so many tourists to apply as group tourists, they started applying as independent tourists, even though they were actually on group tours. And I knew this was happening because I saw waiting in line with Chinese group tourists, because I had to wait just like other non-ROC citizens. I waited in line with them, and I saw they're in a group. They have a tour director with them, but on their paperwork, and I glanced over their shoulders, the paperwork showed that they listed themselves as independent tourists. So I don't know, no one knows. And I really wish there was better data. And that's why I include the statistics I can. Some of the statistics I include, like Taiwan's share of, like tourism's share of Taiwan's economic spending in Taiwan, or tourism's share of Taiwan's economy. These are based on figures from like the World Tourism and Travel, I don't know, whatever organization, like trade association groups that have an interest actually in going on about how important tourism is. And on almost all of these indices, Taiwan is relatively low, which is to say, like for a place like Thailand or Macau, where tourism is really central to their economy, Taiwan is one of the least tourism reliant countries in the world, which again shows actually how incredibly potent tourism is geopolitically, that was talked about so much, that the travel industry took to the streets, that newspapers, not only in Taiwan, but particularly in China, were going on and on and on about the devastation caused by the lack of Chinese tourists. And this is why Tsai should do the 90 and so on. It shows really just how geopolitical tourism is. It's worth so little money, but it's the most visible aspect of this cross-strait policy. Okay, what else? About tour guides, yeah, like the Taiwan tour guides came from really wide variety of backgrounds. I don't have any statistical data. I'll say a lot of them went from other industries, and in the around 2010, as Chinese tourism started really rising, there was a lot of money to be made in commission shopping. And this is something I didn't talk about so much in the presentation, but I knew this because I'd been a tour director in China. So much of Chinese tourism, the income is not from the people paying for the tour, it's from shopping. Like the commissions on buying fake jade, fake coral, or real jade and coral, even worse, is maybe like 70%. Like it's incredibly high commissions, and this is what pays the tour guides, the drivers, and so on. You know, often the tours are actually run at a loss to allow for the shopping to make up for this. And this is true not just in Taiwan, but particularly true in China. And a lot of the tourists are savvy to this. They know what's up. And again, as I mentioned, that just made Taiwan seem more like China to them. And so there was a lot of money to be made for a few years by drivers and tour guides. So people came from a wide variety of backgrounds. That's probably the best I can say about it. To sensory differences, could I go deeper about the kind of paradox or contradiction between Renao and Wenro as different kinds of affects? Sure, absolutely. People pick and choose between those things. How can you be both Renao and Wenro at the same time? You know, that's there's all kinds of ways to think about that more deeply. About mainlander travel cartels, I mentioned in the book, but not in the presentation. Many of the travel associations, like the heads of the tour guide association, the head of the hotel association, most of them had mainlander backgrounds, and most of them had ties to the KMT or the PFP, James Song's party, which was allied and Pan Blue and pro-China, and they would throw fundraisers for them. And they told me about this quite frankly, and they said, well, not only is this good for business, and some of them went with the KMT in 2006 to meet with the CCP in China to kind of plan for the post-KMT future. But they also said because they have mainlander backgrounds, they understand Chinese tourists better. They share a cultural sensibility. I think something that's probably changed since then and now is that, well, like for younger generations, that, you know, most people under 40 don't have that strong of identity, even if they're, you know, third generation mainlanders. It's not really something they think about that much, as much as the heads of these associations did 10 years ago. So I think that's something that's probably changed. Also, as far as cartelization, and something that everyone in Taiwan talked about, Itiaolong, and this kind of like one company running the whole tour, taking you to the same stores and the same hotels run by the same cartels. Oh, it's very hard for me to trace management and ownership structures of these things. A lot of this stuff is hidden through various shell companies. So I did what I could. I verified as much of this as possible, but it's hard. It was very hard as a sole researcher to get much better data on that, as well as these statistics. Anything else? Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe we can take some more questions. We're going to take some time for the questions because that's interesting. Yes, you raised your hand.
Make this work. Okay. Thank you so much for the talk and the answers and questions afterwards. They were very enlightening. I had a question about a potential portion of the tours that would feature indigenous displays in Taiwan. Like I know of groups that would be taken to hotels where there would be like made up rituals or dances, and I was wondering if there was a portion of those tours that featured indigenous displays, if there was like bouncing off other questions that you had today, if there was a specific sociological inclination regarding those tours and what they tell.
Right.
Do we have maybe a last question? Or you can.
Sure, great. Yeah, thank you for that question. So I went to, well, in chapter 3, I talk about in Sun Moon Lake, various women wearing indigenous outfits and selling what they presented as indigenous goods in ways that were really similar to the kinds of tourism you would observe in Southwest China. Typically women wearing costumes and performing in this kind of exotic and alluring kind of way. To sell stuff, and tour guides often male tour guides often further laying on the kind of exotification and erotification of indigenous women in particular more thickly to sell stuff. That said, on the group tour beyond the shopping sites, there was very little interest among most group tourists in indigenous Taiwan anything. typically they said, yes, we also have our ethnic minorities too. They didn't say indigenous because there is no discursive indigeneity, right? That would suggest that, well, there's colonial practices at work in China, right? Instead, it's ethnic minorities, 少数民族, and the tour guides were hip to that. My tour guides also said 少数民族. They even said 高山族, high mountain people, to using this this archaic, anachronistic, and often racist terms to talk about Taiwan's indigents. He did say things like, when we were in Hualien, there were some indigenous people selling CDs, and he said, you can buy the Gaoshan, maybe sometimes he was kind of inconsistent. You can buy the Gaoshan Yuanzumin or Gaoshan Minzu or Gaoshan Shaosu Minzu's Guangpan. They're using a mainland Chinese term for CD. He's very skillful at this. And I asked my fellow tourists, because I was a tourist with them, what do you think of this? Are you interested in this stuff? And they said, nah, again, we have our Shaosu Minzu. They also like to sing and dance and drink. We're not into that. Whatever. And we went to, for example, when we went to Sun Moon Lake, near Sun Moon Lake is the Jiuzhu. It's like this old, very out of date nine tribe, because there used to be 9 registered indigenous groups in Taiwan. I think it's now 16, right? But there's this indigenous culture park in Nantou that we didn't go to, and almost no Chinese tour groups. I asked, like, why don't Chinese tour groups go there? And most tour guides would say, well, yeah, because Chinese tour groups have their minority groups too. They're not that interested. But I think another reason actually is it would have cost more money to the travel agency to do that if there's an entrance price. Whereas, like, kind of cruising around Sun Moon Lake, going to these hidden shopping destinations and eating in unmarked basement restaurants, sometimes with women dressed up as indigenous people was enough. It was, cheaper for the company, while also kind of selling some Taiwanese exotica. But more interesting than that was like Taiwan's Cold War history. Certainly not as a separation from China. Certainly nothing about the White Terror that was avoided. When we went to Kaohsiung, we went to see the Love River. We walked around a 228 memorial. The guide wouldn't even take us near it because he said, I asked him, what's up with this? Like, why don't we at least walk through it? We have to actually walk farther to walk around it. And he said, we don't talk about that because that's kind of what their people did. And by which he meant mainlanders, but it wasn't. It was a very different kind of mainlander. But always emphasizing Chineseness, very seldom emphasizing indigeneity, unless it was just like a way to sell stuff. Yeah, there was no made up song and dance, no ritual. I think there were some indigenous communities that did try to make some more money. And of course, there's all kinds of very complicated ties between the king of Hualien, convict, former magistrate / convict, Fu Kunqi, who has all kinds of interesting exchanges between indigenous groups in Hualien and groups in minority groups in China, trying to get on this train. But I think for the majority of Chinese tourists, it was not as interesting as other aspects of Taiwan. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Maybe we're gonna finish here, and then if you have more questions, we can always, there's some coffee and things to eat here, so we can ask more questions, of course. So thanks a lot for this presentation, for this lecture. Thanks. Thank also to Benjamin for being here, Benjamin Taunay, for being here, also to discuss the book. So we're gonna close the lecture here. And again, thank you a lot for coming here.
Thanks so much, Benjamin. I hope to see you in a few months.
I hope so. Keep in touch for Nathaniel.